morning, everyone, and welcome to this webinar on community-led housing with RTPI London. My name is Lou, and I'm on behalf of RTPI London. I'd like to introduce my panelists. So today we've got Sue Mance, who's the president of RTPI. We've got Councillor Paul Bell, Hannah Gretton, Levent Kerimol, and Ted Stevens from RUSS. And this seminar is going to be built around case studies of two community land trusts in Lewisham in South London. So it's Brasted Close, which is a development of 11 homes, all affordable, and Churchgrove, which has 35 homes, 17% affordable, but allied to other community built projects. Now, we all know London is often a place where people move through or have to put up in inappropriate housing, where many of the barriers to people engaging and shaping their locality are through the planning system. There's unprecedented pressure on land and planning resource and housing finance, and on development models that rely on human input and levels of stakeholder dialogue and risk-taking seldom seen in mainstream regeneration. Against these challenges, community-led housing holds out a promise that we can strengthen communities at the same time as improving housing availability and affordability, and making places of long-term residence that many can be part of and proud of. So I hope that by hearing more about these two schemes, and their backstories and objectives, and contrasting their different development journeys through the London planning and property maze, we can start to identify ways in which to improve our planning system. So the format today is that we're going to have a series of short presentations, followed by a response by Sue Mance, and then I open the floor to questions. Please do send us your questions as we go, and please do excuse us if there are issues with the sound. I'm now going to introduce our first panelist, Lev Kerimol.
Hi there. Hi there. I'm Levent Kerimol. There's a bit of a delay on the line, so I'll apologise for that in advance. Can I get the slides? I think yes. I can move them, but I can move them. There we go. Hello. Right. Slightly different. So I'm from Community-Led Housing in London, which is the resource and advice hub, enabling hub for community-led housing in London. So community-led, yeah, it's gone funny again. I don't know who needs to do that, but so community-led housing is where people take a leading and lasting role in developing and managing their housing. There is a more longer, complicated definition, which I'm not going to bore you with today, but it's a growing movement across London. We're seeing more and more communities involved in trying to take control of their housing situations, and there are a wide range of different kinds of projects that can take many forms. They can be all sorts of different sizes, and large and small, shared houses, communal spaces. It can cater for different needs. That can be intergenerational, older people, people on lower incomes. It can be also delivered in a range of different ways, from self-build or in partnership with housing associations or developers. I could talk about loads of examples, but from the kind of public sector perspective, I find one of the more interesting things is the level of innovation. So almost every group has something unique, something that they're trying to test out that isn't quite working through conventional means for their communities. So often they are proposing innovative responses. It can be a way of diversifying housing supply and contributing and unlocking particular sites that might be difficult otherwise. So adding additionality to housing provision. A key part of the community-led housing definition is about locking in affordability in perpetuity. And usually there's a motivation for better design and higher levels of sustainability. But I think beyond that and around that is the kind of social side of it. So creating communities and environments that are more mutually supportive, having residents that care about their area, and just making better places, and that sense of empowerment that you're not on the receiving end of a system that and that can apply to all sorts of different kinds of housing tenure. So even the market housing that we see as possibly giving the most choice can also be a pretty standardized product that you don't get a lot of say in. I think I've moved forward, but it's not necessarily moving forward. Okay, so I'm just briefly going to touch on a couple of projects. I know we've got we've got a couple of other speakers that are going to be talking about some of their projects in more detail, but just to say, it's going to go too far back now, isn't it? It's very slow in responding to slides, so I will talk about a small co-housing scheme very briefly, where it's all market value. It's if I can go back one more slide, which maybe it will, I don't know. Never mind. I'll talk about Naked House, which is a project that has a couple of sites in Enfield, doing a couple of garage infill sites. The idea behind that is to provide the bare minimum. So as a sort of community-led developer, they're building a minimal shell that allow people to add to and customize their own homes, and the kind of wider area immediately in front of the homes is kind of a common effort. So you can see kind of communal spaces. So there's areas to extend floors if you need to, spaces to build up and extend. So it's kind of pre-planned for that. The leather market scheme is comes from a tenant management organization taking on infill development very close to existing properties, and that's working very closely with the council at council rents, but where a parallel organisation to the tenant management organisation owns the 27 units which they've recently built, and they've gone on to identify other sites. They've got another 40 sites, 40 units in planning at the moment. I can move on. I haven't talked much about the older women's co-housing, but that's another example where it doesn't have to be a geographical community. It can be a kind of a community of interest or a demographic community. And we work with groups at an early stage, kind of giving advice and mentoring on options of how they might incorporate, how they might structure themselves, how they might go about the project, explaining the development process. We also manage small grants on behalf of the GLA to groups at an early stage to help them with kind of technical aspects. So where they need to carry out design work, viability work, legal fees, and our tendency is to try to empower them as clients. So we'll grant them the money rather than doing things for them and just giving them the advice or the pros and cons of different options. Also, in parallel to that, if the slides move on, we work with councils and housing associations and others to create opportunities for community-led housing, so trying to move it into a more mainstream part of housing delivery. So we're working with people like Tower Hamlets, Croydon, Hamlets putting out a number of sites specifically for community-led housing, specifically for affordable self-builders, they've called it. There's been a lot of interest in that one. The sites were about to go out just during the coronavirus periods, which they've just held off, but there's about 8 groups for each site of about 8 people that want to be able to access more affordable housing. Waltham Forest have a similar thing, and Barking Dagenham as well. And these are some of their documents. So that's all using a program that I happen to be involved in at the GLA called the Small Sites program. So getting technical, it's a way of putting sites out for communities to make proposals for, but avoiding the lengthy, cumbersome OJU process that is often required for land disposals, keeping it as a disposal, but giving a large degree of control to the public sector landowner in that case, so making them subject to planning. And then we found you could put restrictive covenants that say this site can only be used for 100% affordable housing, etc., etc. So you're kind of protecting what happens to that land without requiring it through an OJU development agreement. And more on the planning side, it's not something we've given a little bit of advice to Croydon, but looking at site-specific allocations and whether for some privately owned sites there might be an opportunity to specifically designate sites for community-led housing. I know that's happened with other local authorities outside of London. Maybe Ted can fill in for custom and self-build, or indeed including that as a proportion of developments. And then on the kind of development management side, we find that many of the community-led housing groups and schemes are innovating with different kinds of tenures, different typologies of housing. So having a more flexible approach to how we conceive of affordability is quite important from the planning application process. So I think I will leave it there. I apologise for the slightly chaotic nature of the presentation.
Thank you, Lev. I'd now like to introduce Councillor Paul Bell of Lewisham.
Good morning, everyone. I hope you can hear me okay. So I don't have any presentation to do in terms of slides. So I'm just going to talk about Lewisham and its context. But first of all, I've been elected to Lewisham Council from 2010. And Lewisham is a very diverse and has a population of over 300,000 people. It's a very green borough, and it's also quite an innovative borough. And what we find interesting about community land trusts is the community aspect. Years and years ago in the former Labour government, there was something called place shaping. And it's just a term that can be often quite meaningless, but to shape or design a place around community is absolutely vital in how the community works together and knits into the general quilt of the local authority. And we've also got a background where affordable housing is a term that people don't trust anymore. They don't believe in.
Pardon the interjection, Paul. Paul, pardon that, but we couldn't hear you. Do you mind going back to what you were saying again?
Yeah, sure. Can you hear me now? Okay. So I was saying in the former Labour government, there was something called place shaping. And in Lewisham, we're extremely keen on that idea of community and place shaping around individuals and families and the local community down there. So you do development with the community and not against the community. And development generally across London sometimes can become a battle rather than a cooperative kind of community-led aspiration and scheme development in that way. So we are extremely keen on having that kind of development with the local community and that place shaping. Lewisham also is a very green borough, so there's a lot of environmental groups and also aspects to how we want to design buildings. And we've recently signed up to various different organisations, one of which is Peter in terms of trying to do development without any animal products to fight climate change. That's just the brief overview from where I'm coming from, or where Lewisham's coming from. And incidentally, our mayor, we've got a directly elected mayor, Damien Egan, and he's also very keen on the community design and how we do development on a community-led aspect. So Lewisham has always had a strong history of self-build. In the 1980s, working with pioneering architect Walter Siegel on a low-cost self-build projects in the borough. Lewisham is again at the forefront of what we hope is a resurgence of self-build, and working with community land trusts to work with community and develop land that's difficult for us to do because of the scale of it, but also adds to the local community that I was saying earlier. And Lewisham is I believe, the only local authority in London to have 2 projects which have both achieved planning consent recently and are ready to commence building. Obviously, we're all living in the COVID-19 world, so things are delayed. And we were racing ahead with our own house building, our home building program. And because of the COVID-19, we are having to be more pragmatic with timescales. So we are supporting the 2 community land trusts in that way with the GLA. So the first one is Brasted Close, which is 11 homes on the site of an underused garage block in Sydenham. And the interesting thing about developing on garages, some people hate them until they see they're going to be demolished. So we have a situation where people start saying, well, I want to keep my garage. And when we do consultation around increasing of the council rents, usually it's not the increase of the council rents that gets a lot of the attention, it's the increase in garage rents. But a lot of the garages are so small because they're built so long ago that modern cars can't fit into them. So we've got a number of garages where we've just had to board them up because they're not being let, but some people hold on to them for some understandable reasons around storage, because a lot of modern design doesn't have a lot of storage. And I think the problem with a lot of development in London is it's built for profit and not built for living. And the idea around lifetime homes should be truly lifetime homes. So you should be able to be in a building where you can live for your entire life, which means changing walls, changing rooms, being truly lifetime rather than just having a label applied to it. And that's where we hope community land trusts have an important role to play. So Brasted Close is 100% affordable at discounted market sale. The London Community Land Trust and Lewisham Citizens have been leading the engagement, which has included public events, selecting the architects and forming a steering group. And we think it's really important that that process is done very well in order that people outside and inside can really understand what is trying to be achieved from this. And it's not a profit-driven aspiration, it's actually a people-driven aspiration, going back to the place shaping that I was talking about before. Planning permission was achieved to deliver the new homes for local residents based on the local median income representing roughly 50% of market value. And sometimes I sit on strategic planning for Lewisham Council on behalf of Mayor and Cabinet, and developers come up with discounted market rent, but it's never 50% discounted market rent, or market value. So this scheme is really, really good in that respect. So any future sales on Brasted Close will use the same formula, so homes remain affordable as in an understanding that people can really attach to and understand and accept. Local engagement through LT and Lewisham Citizens has been very successful, with only one objection at planning. Now, those of you that attend many planning committees will know that one objection is quite rare. I was at a planning meeting about a year ago where there were 170 people, let alone objections, at the meeting. So it can be, to achieve one objection is an achievement in itself. And the new model has led to some delays and lessons learned, but London Community Land Trust and the council have worked together to resolve these issues. And I think local government and local democracy is about not just the engagement and true engagement. It's about resolving issues and working together collectively to overcome what can be quite unsurmountable problems. So then I'll just move on to Church Grove. Now, Church Grove is a site, a former council site, and it had a school on it originally, I think. And some of the residents down there were very alarmed by what was being talked about in terms of that site. And it's gone through many iterations. But what we've decided to do is work with RUSS, the Rural Urban, I can't remember what RUSS stands for. RUSS, we'll be able to tell you. But Rural Urban Synthesis Society, apologies, as a dyslexic, these acronyms sometimes do get very interesting. So 33 residential units on a cleared site, what is in what we call Lewisham Central Ward, near to the town centre. It will be managed by the Community Land Trust RUSS, 100% affordable again with 5 social rented homes, but I think that's now increased. 2 London Living Rent properties, 14 shared equity and 12 shared ownership. The properties will be part of a self-build, providing training opportunities and residents involved in the design process, including customizing the internal layout. And what I was saying before about truly lifetime homes, the discussion and consultation sometimes just revolves around what kitchen countertop you want or what doors you want in your kitchen. This is actually about the fabric internally of how people will live in these homes. And I think that's really quite important, because it's all very well for architects and for planners, no offense, to talk about what people actually want, but you don't really know what people want until you ask the people who are going to be living there. So this is an important and quite exciting concept, really, in that kind of place shaping around the internals of the building. And also it's providing training opportunities, and myself and the mayor went down there recently, and giving people aspiration, not only in housing, which is not a luxury, it's a right, but aspiration, developing skills and moving forward, particularly with job prospects, is truly an enabling and a delivering function of what a local authority should be doing with partners like RUSS. So again, it's really quite exciting. It's a really nice site, quite close to amenities as well. To be eligible, people must have a local connection to Lewisham and be unable to afford a suitable home on the open market. The social rented homes are for people on the council waiting list, and in Lewisham we retain 100% of nomination rights, and that's our policy. So we've been nominating people from our housing register who are assessed on need. It includes this community hub with laundry, an admin office and shared workspace. Again, sharing facilities, this collective approach to a community is really exciting. And RUSS has recently asked the GLA for further grants so building can commence next spring, which myself and the mayor and the council supports, because we've done this is a long time coming, really, and we need to find ways of enabling this to work or to develop faster. I remember first hearing about the scheme on with RUSS about 7 or 8 years ago. So development is often not as quick as we'd hope, but I think taking that time and working with the local community is vital for working with the community and not against the community. And having toured the site, I think it's going to add a huge amount of community value rather than commercial value or profit to Lewisham's community, and I think it's something rightly to be proud of. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paul. I'd now like to introduce Hannah to tell us more about Brasted Close.
There we go. It said I couldn't unmute myself. How's that? Can you hear me? Wonderful. And I should be able to move the slideshow along. Is that right? There we go. I'll wait for the think there might be a little delay, but thank you, and great to be here. Thank you to everyone for organising this, and there we go, that's working. Yeah, as I was introduced, my name is Gretton. I'm a community organiser with Lewisham Citizens, which is an alliance of schools, faith groups, colleges, charities and community groups working together in Lewisham for the common good. And so housing isn't the only thing that we're involved in by any means. We work on everything from campaigns for a zebra crossing outside a school through to national immigration policy. And really our way of working, I think as Councillor Paul introduced as well, is this idea of people before programme. And so all of the work that we do comes from listening. We start with listening, and that's how this project arose. And so must have been 2013, in the beginning of 2014, our members in Lewisham did a big listening campaign asking hundreds and hundreds of people, what is it that's putting pressure on you and your community? And among lots of things that came up, but one of them was around housing and the issues in housing. Lots of different issues within that, but one particular that came out was this issue of people who didn't qualify for social housing or weren't high on the list, but were totally locked out of the housing market privately, in this kind of intermediate space. And this is something for me that is personal to me. I'm very lucky. I have a comfortable home with a spare bedroom, but that spare bedroom has been bedroom for my 3 younger siblings, all of whom have good jobs, and you know, in other cities would be able to afford to have their own homes, but in London they're having to kind of pile on in my spare room and on my sofa. And this kind of thing was coming up from so many people in our membership, people who particularly a lot of people whose children in their 20s or 30s who were working as nurses or teachers weren't able to afford to stay in Lewisham, and were having to make the difficult choice between living living with their parents, or having to move out of the community that they loved and known for their whole lives. And so really this idea came from that why we wanted to have a community land trust in Lewisham, and it was great to be doing that alongside RUSS, kind of exploring this together along with Lewisham Council. But in these pictures you can see this was an assembly at Deptford Green Secondary School, where we spoke to then Mayor Steve Bullock and posed this idea. This was in 2014. Said, will you work with us to have a community land trust in Lewisham? And there was a commitment of like exploring it and moving forward, which goes through to 2 years later, after a lot of conversations and work, where we have lots of our members at a cabinet meeting where in 2016, where the Brasted Close site was released, and Paul talked about that in his presentation. But you can see the picture down here of the garages. This is the site in Lewisham, between Lewisham and between Sydenham and Forest Hill, and the map of where the site lies. And so we had this site that was released for us to build genuinely and permanently affordable homes on. But the nature of the way that we wanted to do it was community led, and so we set about, as Paul described, building a steering group made up of our people from organisations around and also residents, and over a series of, it was over 50 workshops, engagement events, door knocking activities, sessions with children from the nearby school. We chose the architects. There was a vote literally on the site by local residents and our members, who chose Archeo, and then a number of sessions in the garages themselves, as you can see, where we basically really tried to do engagement and ownership properly. I know that I'm also a resident of Lewisham. I've been to some community engagement events of some large developers that are going to be, where things are going to be built right near my house, and we've asked questions and shaped things, and then we see months later that nothing we said had any influence. And we really wanted it to be a totally different way of working. And so when residents said, actually, we don't want that to be grass there, we want that to be hard because we want to be able to have barbecues there, the architect said, great, well, it's up to you, we're going to change that. And when the school you know, had wanted to shape the way that windows worked or different things, that happened and was really taken into account. And I think also, as Paul said, I think just to emphasize that for us, the real thing that came up, and the reason that it was so important to us was around this issue of affordability, was that we wanted it to be genuinely and permanently affordable. So as Paul said, you know, local incomes, it's based on local incomes, not market rate, and so the homes are around 50% of market rate, which we're really proud of and excited about, but also that they're permanently affordable, so they're in the ownership of the community in perpetuity. And secondly, our kind of second priority is that community-led aspect. So as well as being the decisions, like key decisions being made by neighbours and the steering group, also when they're owned, they'll be owned by a team of people who are making those decisions as well. And I think for us that's really important, because so often communities yeah, don't have any power about the way that their neighbourhoods are shaped, and we really wanted to make sure that it's not just token decisions, but actually the whole process itself is giving people power to be able to act on other things that they care about. And so so the whole process is about developing people and developing the capacity of people to act. And so skipping forward, we handed in our planning permission in, this is the steering group that was kind of formed out of a team of our members, so people from schools and churches and mosques nearby, as well as neighbours from the site who collectively shaped the process along with us and London CLT. And then in 2018 we handed in our planning permission, and as Councillor Paul said, we were really proud of that, of having only one objection, although we were really hoping for none. But we had hundreds of letters of support, and this is the kind of the project that emerged. So this is the design from RKO, which we're really proud of. 11 homes that will be available based on, and the way that they'll be allocated, I think was something that's really exciting as well, because that's been decided by that steering group, which is connection to the local area. So like, you know, you've lived in Lewisham for a long time, but also the kind of the investment that you've had in the local area. So do you use Lewisham as a dormitory and commute into work in the centre of town, or do you see Lewisham as a home where your kids are in school, or where you coach a football team, or where you go to the mosque, or where you have your life embedded into that community? Financial eligibility, so you're in that middle ground where you can't afford to buy your own place on the market, but you also don't qualify for council housing. We don't want this to be, it's not a replacement for social housing, but it's that to fill that intermediate gap, but also housing needs. So we're prioritising people who are in housing need at the time of applying to get the homes. And finally, the commitments to the values of London Community Land Trust, which is kind of the hardest to judge, but is really important. And so we handed in our planning permission, and about 11 months later, we were successful and celebrated. And since then, we've been working really hard on the kind of next steps. What do we do? And for us, it's been a real learning journey. I think for us and Lewisham Council, and I'm sure RUSS, everyone at RUSS will say the same about this process, that we've learned a lot through this journey. I think some of the challenges have really been how the planning system has been set up in a way that makes it much easier if you're a large developer, and we've been learning with every step of the way how you do that if you're a community group that's small, that's only got you know limited resources but also limited time, and you know, when there's a delay of, you think something's going to take a few months and it takes many months, like the implications that has, but also some of the real positives. And I just want to end on one of my favorite things, which is that some of the work of enabling people to participate and develop their capacity to act has meant that some of the neighbours at the site have now been using the skills that they've learned to do other things. And so if we weren't in lockdown right now, in the middle of a pandemic, some of the neighbours were going to be organising a community festival at the site before we get rid of the garages, using some of their art skills and working with the Lewisham Council to create a kind of a community-led exhibition. Some of the other people involved have been leading a campaign to get street lights, to get lights on a bridge that's dangerous down the road. And actually the whole process, we really want to be saying to people, how can you do this? How can we do this so that we're able to learn how to act in other ways and be more powerful? So yeah, that's us. And yeah, over to Ted.
Can you hear me?
Thank you, Hannah.
Okay. My background is I was a journalist for a long time, and then I ran a thing called the National Customers Self-Build Association. I set it up in the early noughties, but also in my sordid past for a long time, I was editor of planning magazines. So the planners who are watching might want to throw bricks at the screen at this point. But anyway, let me go through the RUSS story. Hopefully we're on to slides moving. No, yeah, here we go. Okay. This project, the Rural Urban Synthesis Society, as Paul says, it's a bit of a mouthful, which is why everybody just uses the acronym RUSS, involves, I'm trying to go forward here. Is somebody driving the slides for me? Could someone? I don't seem to have control. Okay, here we go. Could somebody take it forward one? Here we go. Okay. The RUSS project is about sort of trying to create something that's really replicable across London, and its roots go back, as Paul said, to the early Water Seagull schemes in Lewisham 30 odd years ago. The homes on the left were built by people on the social housing waiting list. They were very simple to build, very simple to construct, and very low cost. And now those schemes are, some of the most popular homes in Lewisham. They're really wonderful little oases of beautiful housing. And it was out of that the RUSS scheme took off, because one of the sons who grew up in one of those homes was desperately looking for somewhere to live, and his dad said to him, well, look, why don't you organise a group and get a group together and make it happen? And that's how the seeds were sown for RUSS. If you could go on to the next slide, that would be great. And this was back in 2008, so it's taken 12 years to get to where we are. And it's been seen as a bit of a pioneering project, particularly because of its scale and the focus on affordability and the desire to make it as sustainable as possible and to involve people in some elements of building it as well. So lots of people have supported RUSS over the years. We're now up to just under 1,000 members. Some of them there you can see on the site of the former school in Church Grove. The picture at the bottom shows some of the co-design workshops where the residents were working through with the architects on how the scheme would take shape. Could someone move the slide forward if that's possible? And the support for it's been phenomenal, really. The media seems to be, regularly reporting on RUSS's progress. Oliver Wainwright from The Guardian, he's passionate about it. He sees it as a way of, the big society in action and an example that other local authorities could well do to follow. And if the next slide could come up, even Kevin MacLeod, Mr. Grand Designs, is passionate about it. I built my own place. He's absolutely right about the first bit. It's empowering, enriching, but very tough to do. We don't have much of a culture for it at the moment, but that's changing. And he says RUSS is a pioneering group that has grown out of that self-build culture in Lewisham, and they deserve every ounce of support. In fact, they deserve to be cheered on. And we've had huge support, not least from Lewisham Council. Lewisham Council has made this project happen for us. Without them, it just would not have happened. But the GLA and several other grant aiding bodies have really supported us. On to the next one, if we can. What makes our project different? Well, I think it is going to deliver truly affordable and relatively sustainable homes. We started out with an ambition to make the homes super eco, passive house, but the costs of that and the challenges associated with it are making that a little difficult. If we go on to the next one, there's a series of bullet points here that build up, so if you can just rattle through them. The residents have been very involved in it, just like Hannah explained with her project and the neighbours. And I think it's because the media's focus has been on it, it's been seen as a sort of a bit of a prototype, a bit of a trailblazer for community-led affordable housing in London. And lots of other groups have been inspired by it, come down to see it. And we run workshops for other groups explaining how to get projects like this off the ground, and lots of people come to those. On we go, if that's okay, to the next slide. So progress to date, we got the site from Lewisham Council 4 or 5 years ago now. We had to go through the European Union procurement process, but it was open to groups who were keen to deliver community-led housing at the time. In Lewisham, there weren't many others apart from us, so we were able to squeak in under that rule. Onto the next slide. We've got planning in 2018. The homes are all allocated to local people who meet those key affordability criteria. But after getting planning, we realised we then had to go through ticking off all those planning conditions, and that is incredibly expensive. And you know, if you went to our residents who were all on low incomes and said, look, could you all chip in about 20 grand each, please, to get us through the planning conditions, it just wouldn't have been possible. But the GLA really rescued us. They had an housing innovation fund, and we secured about £1 million from that to make it happen. And the last bullet point here, in the summer of last year, we built our community hub building. About 90 different volunteers were involved in that. Some of them, you know, gave up 2 months of work to work on the project, and nearly killed themselves in the process. They were really passionate about making it happen. And those of you who've been in it and seen it will know it's a lovely little building, hand built with blood, sweat and tears by volunteers from RUSS. And on to the next slide, if you can. What have we learned? Well, it's incredibly challenging. It's taken a long time. A lot of people have had to put a lot of effort into this. It's not as straightforward as delivering homes in perhaps more conventional ways through a housing provider or a big developer. And it does cost a lot up front. All those surveys into unexploded ordnance that might be underneath the site, the flood alleviation modelling exercises that went on and on and on. Scores and scores of them, each one, planning colleagues, costs a small community group thousands of pounds to hire consultants to do. And partly because of that, and partly because tendering prices have gone up. When we got our tender prices in at the end of last year, we discovered that the cost of building it was going to be more than we'd originally budgeted. We've got funding to build it from the Triodos Bank, all lined up. Lots of financial modelling have been done to prove the sums would work, but the tender cost came in somewhat above what we wanted it to come in at. And so we've had to tweak the scheme. The quaint way of describing it is value engineering. So we've had to lose some of the things we were passionate about. So the sustainability credentials of the building are not as high as they were going to be. So the design has gone from the picture at the top there to the picture at the bottom. We've rationalized it, we've sweated every ounce of excess out of it, and we've had to manage the expectations of our residents who are passionate about some of those features that we've had to compromise on. It's been painful, very painful. And it's taken ages to do. It's taken ages to do, from beginning 2008 to now, 12 years. And quite often the key people who've driven this, all volunteers, virtually every one of them's a volunteer, those who get involved can only do it for so long. They sort of run out of energy and passion. So some of our key people have burnt out. And I think other groups will go through the same pain that we've gone through, I'm sure. On again, if we can. Can the slide go forward, if that's okay? But, you know, all that support is still there from Lewisham, who have been absolutely fantastic. the GLA, and the London Community Hub. You know, those guys have really made it work, and there is a passion to make this thing happen. On again, if we can. I think there's real scope to make a big impact in places like London and other urban conurbations by encouraging this sort of thing. In Europe, it is a mainstream, common way of delivering homes. A huge proportion of them are being built by communities, not by developers with their 25% profit margins, but by communities who are involved right from the start in shaping the homes that they're going to live in. And it's transformational in places like Munich, which is the bottom left picture there. On the edge of the city, they acquire land at agricultural values, they parcel it up in a small plot so that people on low incomes can afford to build their own homes. The people don't just build homes. The picture in the bottom and the middle there is in Amsterdam, where 50 families got together, built homes, built a creche, even a small theatre and restaurants as part of their scheme. The one in the bottom right was a site that developers weren't interested in. It's in Zurich. It was an old tram site, and 100 families got together to build that project, and it's completely amazing and wonderful. And it's not just new builds. The one in the top, in the second in on the top, is a redundant office building in Rotterdam that the council facilitated to be carved up into empty shells that people could fit out. And the one on the right is at the top is an old school. So it doesn't have to be new builds. It can be old buildings that can be repurposed and taken on by communities. And it's become just standard over there. People don't go, oh, how innovative. They just get on and do it. They get on with it quick. On to the last slide, if you can, please. So, yeah, here we go. So how can the planning profession help make more of this happen in the future? I think you should be allocating portions of major sites for community-led housing schemes. That's what happens in Germany. And the benefit of that is that if you give 2/3 of a site to the volume house builders, they'll churn out their standard shoeboxes. And for the people who don't want those standard shoeboxes or can't afford them, you're able to provide housing that suits them and is within their price range. So you get two lots of housing happening together, so you deliver homes faster and you get a more interesting, complex mix of housing. The GLA small site scheme's great, but some of those small sites are really small and really quirky and probably not big enough for viable groups. I think planners need to set proportionate planning conditions. You heard me ranting about that earlier on, but I do think, you know, if a group has got to spend hundreds of thousands of pounds getting surveys written by expensive consultants that I would bet money on most are never read when they come to the planning department, I do think something more practical and cost effective could be done. It's all about the sites. If you guys as planners can facilitate the land, the groups will form and they will build. When I was editor of planning, I used to get lots of people moaning about planners and saying, oh, they just try and stop stuff. I don't think that's the case. I think planners make stuff happen, and this is where you can really, really make stuff happen. And the potential is amazing. In Berlin, 1 in 6 of all the new homes are now being built by communities. Just imagine if 1 in 6 of all the new homes in London were built by communities, and the quality of the homes you'd get, the great placemaking, all of that would be fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Now, while we've been discussing, we've had an audience question. We've been asked how many community land trust homes have been delivered or completed in London in the last 3 years, and how many are expected. So, Lev, could you just fill us in on that?
Yeah, so I think it's roughly about 100 in the last few years. There's projects up in north of Westminster, a really interesting organisation called Walston and Elgin Community Homes. The Leather Market one I mentioned is 27, Older Women Co-housing 25, so roughly about 100, I'd say. And then we also have a pipeline of projects that we're aware of. Many of them are at the earlier stages. So that pipeline is about 1,500. I think some of what Ted was just saying about groups falling away, burnout, or just not being able to secure the sites to get them to happen. I mean, realistically, I think we're planning for about 500 homes in the next, I don't know, 3 to 4 years. It should give a rough idea.
Thank you. Sue, would you like to respond?
I would, firstly, can I say thank you so much to Paul, to Ted, to Hannah and to Lev for those presentations. They really were extremely good and extremely interesting. To me, there's some really clear themes that have come out, and probably the biggest one is community and community engagement, and the fact that your work, I think, as Paul said, it's about developing with, not against the community. And the Brasted one, where you only had one objection, the planning committee, is a real example of success, the fact that you worked hard to do that. But I think also Ted's point about it costs an awful lot, and community engagement, if you do it properly, costs a lot in terms of time and resources. I think also what jumped out to me in terms of the engagement, and I will declare an interest on the Brasted scheme. I was one of the judges of the Housing Awards 2019, and obviously that won. So, you know, I was really, really interested to learn more about it. But the way you actually brought people together on that and involved the full diversity of the community, because so often what people tend to hear from in terms of a quick in, quick out engagement is those who are time rich from certain sections of society, not the inclusive approach that really, really jumps out from this. So I thought those were really, really interesting, along with the engagement once something has been constructed in terms of fitting out. Because one size doesn't fit all, but we seem to forget the after part. So I thought that was really, really interesting. Just one thing I will add, I loved the t-shirt that kid was wearing on one of the photos about I will change the future, and the community land trusts, the approach that you're using will change the future. And I thought that was just a perfect way of capturing it. I think the word I'd use is probably transformational, and I think Ted, you used it in the context of Europe, but in the context of the schemes that you've presented, they are transformational for those people around about, and it isn't just the ones who are living in it, it's the whole community. So what I really want to say, apart from a huge thank you, is I wanted to just put to each of you the same question. And it is, if there was one lesson, and I know Ted shared quite a series of lessons, there was one lesson that you wanted people who are listening to take away from what you have described today, what would it be? I'm not sure whether I should be saying who should start, but perhaps if we start with Paul, if that's, and then work across.
Can you hear me? So you're asking a politician to do some visioning here, so it's quite interesting. So I mean, I could talk about anything really, but I think the one thing that I've learned is that people can do anything as long as you invest in them as human beings. And I think the great thing about community and society is, if your goals are around someone other than yourself, then it can be truly transformative, and that's the one lesson that I see in this in the community land trust.
I think that's really, really poignant. If we move to Ted.
Am I on? Can you hear me? I'd use the word trust, actually, trust people. I remember when I was in Almere, which is this huge city on the edge of Amsterdam that's been virtually entirely self-built. I took a group of miserable British volume house builders over there to see it. And there was a reception in the embassy later in the evening, and one of the house builders, I won't name them, said to the mayor of Almere, a fantastic guy called Adri Dugestein, he said, Adri, how do you make sure that the work that the self-builders have done has been done to the right standard? You know, how do you make sure that the toilets work correctly or that the electrics have been done? And Adri just looked at this guy in sort of disbelief, and he said, we trust them. We think they will want the shitters to work, and they will not want to electrocute their children. And I think that's exactly it. You know, planners should trust people and communities to deliver the homes that they really want. You don't need to be micromanaged. So give them a length of rope to get on with it. Don't strangle them.
I think that's fantastic. That's about trust. Hannah.
I think I mean, both what Councillor Paul and Ted said is kind of what I was thinking, that, you know, people, I loved what you said, Paul, people have the ability to do anything if you invest in them as humans, and as Ted said, if you trust them. I think for us, the lesson is really about the time that this takes and the patience. And I think partly that's the patience of that work of it being community led, is that it's going to be slower if you really want to bring people with you, and that work, you know, a developer can come and do a one-off consultation, and that seems like they consulted, and actually we just never wanted it to be like that. And so that slow and patient work of it being community led, but then also I think the patience that we've had to learn from the way that the system is not necessarily set up to support inherently to support groups like ours, was something that I think we wish we'd learned earlier, and had been prepared for. So I think that mutual, that kind of patience of doing the community work, but also learning how we can work through those things that we had to learn patience for.
Thank you. I think we so often forget, when we're planners, just how difficult it is for others to understand the planning system. And so I think there's a really good lesson in that. Last but not least, Lev.
I'd say, yeah, it is really difficult to get development done, but there are a lot of normal people going through it, and there's no kind of, it's difficult for developers and housing associations too. I think as things, the more and more of these schemes are done and more progress is made, we see it as kind of a growing thing. And I think there's a role for more professional, almost developers, development managers to come in and work to community groups. So you're not having to do all the kind of the grind of development, the kind of day-to-day stuff, but having people who have experience in doing some of that and negotiating development, working to communities in terms of realizing their visions. And I know that some of that happens a lot more in Germany, Europe. So I think that's something for the future that we see growing.
Thank you. I think those were, I've written them down. They're key things that I'm going to take away from what you said today, as well as the presentations. And I just can't wait for this lockdown to be lifted so I can actually come and have a look at these schemes and meet you all in person. So thank you from me very much today for the time you've given. And I hope that everybody listening to the session has taken as much from it as I have. So over to you, Lou. I think we're about 1 minute left.
Thank you all so much for your time. And like Sue said, we really hope once lockdown is lifted, but even before that, RTPI can use our training and our platform to do more to, like Hannah said, to make the system easier for individuals and people who want to do something to navigate. There have been some tremendous themes that have come out here today. I wish we had time to go through them, but we are at 11:30. So I'm just going to thank you all one more time and say keep the conversation going. Thank you.